All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first part of our Intro to Economics / Consumer Theory series. Today, we're really just going to be going over the fundamental, probably most crucial part of consumer theory. Essentially, we're going to be covering the unit of measurement that we're going to be using throughout this whole series. So let's just get right into it. So, in consumer theory, there is something called utility. And utility is essentially a measure of the benefit or, say, satisfaction that a consumer receives from the purchase of a good or a service, or, in the case of employees, maybe the utility they receive from certain salaries and benefits and the risk that those provide. So utility shows up in many, many places. And if we quickly just write this down here, it is a measurement of a consumer's, let's say, happiness. I always forget how many of each letter there is in happiness. Happiness from the purchase of a good or service. Now, if any of you have ever taken any other sort of business course or economics course, then you've probably heard of this concept of marginal, blank, in this case, marginal utility. And marginal utility is essentially the additional utility gained from the purchase of one additional unit. Now, marginal utility is crucial for many different things, but it essentially represents how much benefit we're going to get from continuing to purchase units. And in many cases, as we're going to see, this benefit is decreasing. So I'm just going to write this down here, that marginal utility represents the additional benefit. Let's not focus too much on my spelling. Received from one extra unit of good or service. It's a little rough definition, but hopefully that makes some sense. And I'll actually go over a quick little example right now. So let's take Nintendo Switches, for example. Let's say that the purchase of, so I'll have Switch here, and then we'll have the utility here. Let's say the purchase of one Nintendo Switch gives you a utility of 10. Now let's say if you have two Nintendo Switches, your utility is actually going to be, let's say, 18. Let's say at 3 Nintendo Switches, maybe your utility is, 24. So clearly it's increasing, right? So getting more Nintendo Switches is better. However, what we can now look is at our marginal utility, and we can see by how much each additional unit our utility increased. So from 1 to 2, sorry if that looks a bit like a Z, we increased 8 units. Yet from 0 to 1, if you want to imagine, we had increased 10. So already here, our second switch is giving us less utility than the first. And now here, from 24 to 18, this increased 6 units. So this isn't always going to be the case, but this is a really common case where, despite our utility continuing to increase as we get more units, the actual utility we get per additional unit, so the marginal utility, is decreasing. Eventually, you can see here that if we were to continue this trend, to 4, 5, maybe eventually 6, who knows, maybe here eventually we'll get to 28 if we keep going with this little trend here, and then maybe 30, and then at one point, so this would be 4, this would be 2, and then at one point maybe here it stays at 30, and then we start actually getting possibly negative utility. So at one point, maybe the money that we spent on this additional unit is actually not beneficial. So maybe at 7, it's actually 29. Who knows? It's not always so straightforward, but this, you could actually be going downwards now. And you never want to go here. You want to maximize your utility, which means, as we'll learn later on, we're going to want to stop around this 5 to 6 mark, because after this point, we start getting negative utility added on. It just wouldn't make sense to purchase anything more. So if we just erase this real quick, utility has a few benefits and possibly a few drawbacks. The biggest drawback that I can mention right now is that it's kind of made up. You cannot see directly, you cannot directly see how much utility someone gets from purchasing something. You're making more estimations, and it's on its own, it doesn't even mean that much. Its biggest use comes when we start comparing the utility between different amounts of goods, like we just did with this Nintendo Switch example. Knowing that one Nintendo Switch gives you 10 utility and not knowing anything else really doesn't mean that much. The 10 is an arbitrary number. As we're going to learn later, you can in fact change this number to be nearly anything through different transformations of the utility functions. So the numbers on their own aren't as relevant as the actual ranking of the different amounts of switches are. Now, another disadvantage is that you can't actually compare utility between two people, similar to before, because utility is an arbitrary number that can be changed. If I get a utility of 10 for a Nintendo Switch and you got a utility of 8 for your first Nintendo Switch, that doesn't actually mean that I like it more than you necessarily. What's more important is going to be how the next Nintendo Switch affects our decision, or maybe how purchasing one Nintendo Switch compared to purchasing possibly an Xbox. So, if I got 10 utility from a Switch, but 12 from an Xbox, and you got 8 utility from a Switch and 7 from an Xbox, even though number-wise your utility for the Switch was less, you're still going to purchase a Switch, and I'm going to end up purchasing an Xbox. So that's why you can see a bit why it's more useful in terms of comparing between two people. So yeah, for the moment, this is all you really need to know. In terms of advantages, as I just mentioned, it actually allows us to compare your utility for different amounts of goods, and therefore actually allows us to make kind of predictions as to what your purchase decisions are going to be. Assuming that as a consumer, you're going to make what we call rational decisions. So a rational decision essentially means like a smart decision. It means like if you know that you get more utility from 2 Nintendo Switches, you're going to purchase it. You have no reason not to. It doesn't really take into account that you may be not rational. You may not do that for no actual reason, right? It may be not beneficial for you to do something, yet you'll still do it. That's how humans are in real life. Utility doesn't necessarily capture that perfectly. You're going to see, we're going to assume that we're always going to make the best decision. And I think the last thing to mention here on this basic cover of utility is that it's actually, this measurement is given a unit. The unit is utils. So I'll write that down right now. Measured in what we call utils. You'll see this usually represented by U, possibly, but it's not written down that often, to be honest. Like, often you'll see maybe a utility function, let's say like util for a good, but when you're writing your answer, you'll probably just write the number, let's say 25. You're not going to write 25U. It's not like something like centimeters that you add on to the end. And yeah, so that is the basics on utility.